You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, so let's continue the conversation here regarding Syracuse Basketball 2025 recruiting. We already have talked about the fact that the Orange are predicted to land 3 players in the class, right? They already have Sadqi White, so that's one. But Tipton is saying Kiyan Anthony and Tyler Jackson are likely as well for the Orange. But he also mentioned that Syracuse can get 1 to 2 more players in the class. So these are the guys who are most likely to fill those voids or that void, whatever it is, 1 to 2 players. And it comes down to 2 separate lists, in my opinion. There's order of preference and there's order of likelihood. Now there's 4 players total for the final list, and I'm going to go over all 4 first, and then I'm going to give you my order of preference and my order of likelihood. These are just my opinions. So the 4 players on the final list. Acaden Lewis. I think some of you guys might know him, right? We've talked about him a bit on the podcast. He's 6'1". He is a guard from Maryland, and he's ranked as high as 34th in the country over on 24/7 Sports. He has Syracuse in his top 8. His top 8 include the Orange, obviously, Duke, UConn, Kentucky, North Carolina, Auburn, Michigan, and Tennessee. And before I keep going with Acaden Lewis, just a side note here. Tipton mentioned that there are 2 factors that really play a role in these kids' commitment. Number 1 is NIL, money. They don't really like to say it, but that's just the reality. It's money. And number 2, it's kind of a quasi between playing time and the path to the NBA. So we have to take into account those 2 factors when deciding who we want and who is most likely to commit. So Acaden Lewis, when we're looking at those 2 factors, right? NIL, when they're competing against those other 7 schools, especially for the fact that Syracuse is probably going to land Kiyan Anthony, which is going to cost some NIL money, and Tyler Jackson, which will cost NIL money, and Sadqi White, which will cost NIL money too, right? Combined with the fact that the 7 other schools are blue bloods or big-time programs, that's not too promising. And also, if we're talking about playing time, this is where I kind of step back a little and I say, look, no matter what school Acaden Lewis is going to, he's going to have to fight for his minutes because his top 8 is loaded. He's got a loaded top 8, all great programs. He's going to have to fight for his minutes. So given what Tipton has said are the 2 main factors in kids' recruitment, and obviously it doesn't apply to every single one of them, put this on the lower end of the probability because remember, we're in line to get 3 players, and there's only so much money you can throw around to guys. Only so much. Let's talk about London Jemison. He is a 6'7", 195-pound forward from Connecticut, ranked as high as 39th in the country over on 24/7 Sports. And Syracuse is in the top 6, along with Alabama, Kansas, Louisville, Vanderbilt, and Virginia. Now, let's talk about the playing time factor. There are 3 forwards that could be on the roster for the 2025-26 season. Chris Bell, Donnie Freeman, and Sadiq White. Now, Jair Davis is out of years of eligibility after this season, so he will not be back with the Orange after this year. So, yeah, they already have 3 projected forwards for the 25-26 season. But if you look a little deeper, you know Sadiq White's going to be there. Donnie Freeman? Probably not, given his pedigree. I'm not suggesting he's going to transfer. I'm just saying he's probably a one-and-done player. Remember, 9 of the last 10 number 6 overall recruits in the country have been one-and-done players. 9 of the past 10. So he's likely not going to be back with Syracuse after this year because he's really good. And he's probably going to go to the NBA. Then there's Chris Bell, who we just don't know in this day and age of the transfer portal. So is he going to be back? Is he not going to be back? I am not entirely sure. But let's say conservatively, there are 2 forwards that are back on the roster. There's playing time that's open for London Jemison, which is promising. It's not like the guards and the fact that they're probably going to get Kiyan Anthony and Tyler Jackson, and they still have Elijah Moore on the roster and JJ Starling. Who knows if he'll be back or not, right? There's going to be a lot of competition for the guard spots, but for forwards, less so. It's all going to depend on with London Jemison of how hard Syracuse is actually recruiting him. If they're recruiting him really hard, I would say that there's a higher chance they get Jemison over Lewis. But if they've kind of backed off on Jemison, and again, I don't really know for sure, then I would say that Lewis is a higher probability, because despite what I said with the playing time and the other schools going after Lewis, they're recruiting Acaden Lewis hard. That is known. We just don't know for sure how hard they're recruiting London Jemison. Next up, let's talk about Ryder Frost. He is 6'6", 200-pound forward from Massachusetts, and he is ranked as high as 99th in the country over on On3, and that's in a recent update, so he just sneaks inside that top 100. And the Orange are also in the top 8 for Ryder Frost, along with Notre Dame, Michigan, BYU, Iowa, Virginia Tech, Wisconsin, and Penn State. He has visited Syracuse recently, and by all accounts, it went well. Now, he's also a wing player, which is cool. We don't know how much, though, at the end of the day, these players are going to command in terms of NIL money. Like, we don't fully know. I would say, just based on his recruiting ranking, and given the other players that Syracuse is in the running for, that he would be on the lower end of how much it would cost to get Ryder Frost aboard. I think he would cost on the lower end, and given the fact that they have Sadqi White, they have Kiyan, or they're likely to get Kiyan Anthony and Tyler Jackson. Is Syracuse is kind of running out of money in terms of how much they're willing to spend in recruiting, because you remember you need to save some from the transfer portal. Then Frost is likely in that regard. Remember, he's a wing player, a forward. There's going to be forward openings. And, well, just based on his ranking, a low-end 4-star recruit, he probably won't cost as much as guys like London Jemison or Acaden Lewis. Finally, we're rounding it off with Derek Dixon, a 6'4" guard from Washington, D.C. He's ranked as high as 56th in the country over on ESPN. And Syracuse is in the top 7 for Mr. Dixon, alongside Arizona, Pittsburgh, Virginia, North Carolina, and Vanderbilt. Given that Syracuse seems to be all over Kiyan Anthony and Tyler Jackson, and that they're recruiting Acaden Lewis really hard, I would say that Dixon, probably not. Probably not. And the latest On3 prediction has Syracuse in 4th for Derek Dixon. So there's still an outside chance, but I would say unlikely. Now, let's get into the lists. We've gone over the 4 players that Syracuse is on the final list for. In terms of order of preference, I would prefer Acaden Lewis the most. He is fast rising, and everyone seems to be all over him. Then I would say London Jemison in second, because Syracuse definitely needs a wing player for 2025-26. Derek Dixon, because, well, he's certainly a backup plan if you don't land Acaden Lewis, and for some reason if you don't land Kiyan Anthony or Tyler Jackson. And then there's Ryder Frost, and that's not calling Ryder Frost a bad player or anything, but he's the second best wing that they are going after. He is behind London Jemison. And we're looking at the tiebreaker here between him and Dixon. He's lower ranked than Dixon, so I would give the nod to Dixon over Frost. In terms of order of preference, order of likelihood, in terms of most likely to least likely, I would say that the most likely player that they are to get of those 4 that I mentioned is Ryder Frost. I think the fact that he probably won't cost as much as the other 3, and that they are already seemingly going to get 3 in their class, they might not have the money to be able to go out and get another high-end player. So Ryder Frost is number 1 in terms of order of likelihood. Then 2 and 3 are kind of split. I'm going back and forth, but it's between Acaden Lewis and London Jemison. And number 4, in my opinion, the least likely player that they are to land is Derek Dixon. So overall, if I were to now forecast it, based on what Tipton is saying, the 3 are Sadqi White, Kiyan Anthony, and Tyler Jackson. And then in terms of who's going to fill those final 1 to 2 spots, remember, if you're trying to fill that 1 to 2 more, what Tipton said, probably Ryder Frost is who I'm leaning towards of who's going to be that 4th guy. I think it would be Ryder Frost. And hopefully they can get one of Acaden Lewis, London Jemison, or Derek Dixon. Hopefully they can get one of those 3. But overall, it's really good. If you get the 3 that were already seemingly locks plus a Ryder Frost, that's a really, really strong recruiting class for Syracuse basketball.